How many of you this morning woke up to this sound? Your neighbors have a new goat? A new pet goat? Have you seen a lot of sheep on the road? Walking around, riding on the tops of buses? My wife got a picture of this one in a car the other day over in Assia 2000. He's there in the back, taking a ride around. These aren't people's pet goats. These goats are for a very special reason because today is a holiday. I don't know if you felt it, but today's a holiday. Around the world, it's known as Eid al-Adha. It's the Feast of Sacrifice. Here in Mali, it goes by a different name. It's called Tabaski in a lot of West Africa. And this is a day of sacrifice, and it's a very big holiday in the Islamic world. It happens in Dhul Hijjah, the 12th month of the Islamic year. Happens on the 10th day of the 12th month. Now, the Islamic calendar is a little bit different than our Western calendar, so it's not the same time every year as ours. The day shifts by about 10 days every year, and it's dependent on the moon. The Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar as opposed to our Western calendar, which is a solar calendar. Now, during this time in Islam, two very important things need to happen. First, if you are at all financially able, you are supposed to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, to the holy city of Islam. And that happens during this week, and it's a very special time right now in Mecca. There are literally millions of people there that are celebrating this Muslim pilgrimage. And it ends with this, the El Adha, which is the Feast of Sacrifice. On the Feast of Sacrifice, people come together and they sacrifice a lamb to Allah. Now, this is the most important holiday in Islam. This is even more revered than the end of Ramadan. So this is even a bigger holiday than Ramadan is. This is kind of the equivalent in the Islamic world of Christmas. And what they're celebrating is they're celebrating Abraham, or in English, Abraham's sacrifice, or not sacrifice, of his son. Now, in Islam, during this time, the day begins with public prayer. So not only did we hear the sheep this morning, you probably heard some singing coming from the mosque and some special call to prayers, because the first thing people need to do today is go out to the mosque for prayer time. Then after they finish their prayers, they listen to a sermon at the mosque. Then after the sermon, then they go out and they greet people. Now during this time, everyone has brand new clothes. It's important for people to wear the best clothes they have today to celebrate the holiday. So you're going to see a lot of people that are dressed up today. Okay? You all look beautiful today too. It's also important for people to go out and visit their neighbors. So there might be a chance that someone's going to come and knock on your door today. They're just there to give a greeting and to wish you a happy Tabaski day. And in Bambara, what you can say to them is you can say, Sambe Sambe. Let's try that together. Sambe Sambe. This means have a good holiday. Celebrate. And so people go and they visit their neighbors during this time and they give them greetings. It's also a time when people seek forgiveness from the Lord, and they seek forgiveness from other people, and they also give forgiveness to other people. So this is also a day of forgiveness, a day when people say, I'm sorry for my sins, God, please forgive me. And they go to their neighbors and their friends, they say, if there's anything I've done to offend you, please forgive me for that. And then they also forgive people for their sins or their times that they've done something wrong. It's also a time when people give gifts to their children. So you probably saw a few extra toy sellers on the road this week as people are getting ready for the holiday. But the biggest thing in Tabaski is the animal sacrifice. And that's the sheep and the goats that we've been hearing. For wealthier families, maybe you've seen cows tied up outside of somebody's house. Or maybe this morning you saw them in a different place, just laying down. And during this time, for the sacrifice, people will sacrifice the sheep, they will sacrifice the cow, whatever they can afford. And then today is a day of feast. And they take a third third of the sacrifice, and they share it with themselves. It's a family meal. So everyone comes together. So this is also this has been a big weekend of traveling. If you were out on the road on Friday or Saturday, there was a lot more traffic because people are going out and visiting family during this week, because today they're going to celebrate as a family. So they take a third of their animal and they eat it together as a family. They'll take another third and share it with friends or relatives or people around them. And then they'll take the last third and they'll give that to the poor. So this is a time of sharing. And this is a time when they bring all of these things and they say, this is a day for us all to feast together. So it's a big day of celebration. Also during this time, it historically goes back to God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son. Now in Islam, they believe that God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Ishmael. This is very interesting because the Quran actually never says that Abraham took his son Ishmael. The Quran says that he took his son up for the sacrifice, and the assumption is made that it was Ishmael. Now, when God told Abraham to do this, he did it through a dream. And after Abraham's dream, he shared it with his family. He told his family, God told me to sacrifice our son. And he even told Ishmael. And he said, God told me to sacrifice you. I'm sure Ishmael wasn't real excited about this, but Ishmael did not resist, and he went along with it. During this time, as Abraham started out to make this sacrifice, on the way, Satan tempted him and tried to get him to not go up and make the sacrifice. So what Abraham did was God told Abraham, throw rocks at Satan to chase him away. So Abraham picked up rocks and threw them at Satan and said, leave me, leave me, leave me. This happened 3 times. This is what the Quran teaches. Right now, during the Hajj, during the pilgrimage in Mecca, there is a part of the Hajj where people pick up small pebbles and they toss them at 3 different pillars in Mecca that represent the 3 times that Abraham tossed pebbles at Satan to try to chase him away. As Abraham reaches the mountain, he continues to go up, and he's ready. He lays his son on the altar, he prepares the altar, and he lifts his knife, and he's ready to kill his son. And at that point, God stops him and says, no, Abraham, no. I don't want you to sacrifice your son, but you are a good man. I've tested you. And at that point, God provides a ram as a replacement for Ishmael. And that's what the Feast of Sacrifice is today, is remembering, Muslims are remembering when Abraham didn't sacrifice his son and God provided this lamb instead. And so Muslims recreate that today. Now the story might sound very familiar because in the Christian world we have a story that's very similar, but a couple of the characters change. Okay? We still start with Abraham, but instead of his son Ishmael, we have his son Isaac. And we find the story in Genesis 22, verses 1 through 18. And it begins with, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When they had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he sent them out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And the 2 of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father! Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Isaac wasn't in on the fact that he was going to be the lamb for the burnt offering. But Abraham answered, He said, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham! Abraham! Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time, and he said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. So this is the story as we know it as Christians. Abraham going to sacrifice his son, and then God stopping him at the last minute and saying, I don't want you to sacrifice Isaac because I am going to bless you abundantly through this. I like what God says here. He says in verse 16, I swear by myself, declares the Lord. I swear to God, but he is God. I swear by myself. So Abraham is obedient. This is an amazing, incredible act of obedience. Imagine if God asked you to sacrifice your son, especially if it was your only son. Would you be willing to do that? Would you be willing to take the steps that Abraham did? Abraham's known as a hero of the faith. In Hebrews 11, it talks about the heroes of the faith. And it mentions Abraham as one of the greatest heroes of the faith because he stepped out and did this amazing act. But through this story, actually a little bit before this story, this actually creates the biggest conflict that we have in the world today. Let's talk about that. We're going to step back a few years. We're going to go back in Abraham's story. We're going to go back in Genesis a little bit further. We're going to go back to Genesis chapter 15. And at this point, Abraham has a different name. His name is Abram. And our story begins out. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the only one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside, and he said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So God promises Abram, I am going to bless you abundantly. A huge nation is going to come out of you. But Abram says, how can this be? I don't even have any children. He and his wife were old at this point. They were in their 80s. And God's making him a promise and saying, you're going to have an abundance of children. And he's thinking, how can this be? I'm an old man. But he holds on to God's promise. Now, Abram believed the Lord. And he believed that the Lord was going to bless him and give him this great family. But he became a little impatient. He was in his 80s. He's saying, well, this doesn't seem to be happening with my wife. So maybe I need to do something else. Because he didn't trust that God would be able to perform a great miracle and give him a family in his 80s. And so, Abram decided that he was going to do things his way. God made him a promise, but he wasn't seeing how the promise was going to come together, so he said, I think I need to help God on this. I don't think God has this quite figured out all the way, so I'm going to step in and I'm going to help. Our story continues now in Genesis chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Can you imagine this if your wife told you to go sleep with somebody else? And yet Sarai is saying that to Abram. Kind of like Adam and Eve, where Eve tempts Adam, try this fruit, this is really good. Our story goes on. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now she knows she's pregnant, and she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think is best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Boy, we've got a great soap opera going on here, don't we? The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road of Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all of his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well is called Bir Lanai Rai. It is there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So Abram says, here we go. I did it. I have fulfilled God's promise. I took my wife's servant and I had a child through her. So he thought he had everything in control. He thought that he had the situation fixed because his wife seemed too old to have a baby. He says, I'll have a baby with somebody else. Boom! We're done. God's covenant is now fulfilled. Now it's interesting because Hagar was not a Hebrew. She was an Egyptian. These are the very people that had enslaved, or that will enslave Israel. Egypt was not a good ally of Israel, and yet here Abram is trying to bore the nation of Israel out of an Egyptian slave. Now this caused conflict between Sarai and Hagar, because now Hagar was pregnant, and Sarai was very jealous. She's having the child that I'm supposed to have. And this caused a great problem. Oh, you Brazilians have amazing soap operas, but it's nothing compared to what's going on here. And through this soap opera, it plays out that Hagar gets so upset because Sarai is mistreating her that she runs away. And then Sarai goes to Abraham and tries to blame the whole situation on him. And Abram says, it's not my fault. You told me to do this. She's your slave. You deal with it. And so as this is all playing out, we're seeing this big conflict happen because Abraham heard God's promise, but Abraham did not believe in God fulfilling it, and he thought that he needed to fulfill it himself. And in doing so, look at all these problems that he's created. Well, God looks at Hagar and says, I see you. You are just a pawn in this game. You got pulled into that. You were a slave. You didn't have a choice. And God shows Hagar pity. And he says, I am going to bless you. And you're going to have many descendants that are born out of you. And God gives her this promise too. But God also says this. He says that Ishmael is going to live in hostility. He's going to be like a wild donkey, and he's going to fight with everybody. Now, this is a verse out of the Bible that you never want to quote to a Muslim, to say that Ishmael was a wild donkey. They'll get greatly offended by that because Ishmael is a hero. Ishmael is the father of the Muslim nation. So, Abraham thinks he has everything figured out, but he's obviously stepped out in great disobedience. But God didn't give up on Abram. He didn't give up on Sarai. He didn't give up on what his original covenant promise was. And we're going to pick things up in Genesis 17. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will now be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give you as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. God also said to Abram, As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. Abraham fell face down and he laughed and he said to himself, Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abram said to God, If only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Then God said, Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I've heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. When he had finished speaking with Abraham, God went up from him. So Abraham's trying to figure all this out. He said, Well, God promised me this blessing. It's fulfilled through Hagar and his son Ishmael. And then God comes back and says, No, that's not what I told you. I told you something different. But God doesn't punish Abraham for this. He actually bestows his grace upon Abraham. Because God wants to see his covenant fulfilled even in Abraham's disobedience. And as a symbol of this, God changes the name of Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah. So in the Bible, sometimes you see these two names. They're actually talking about the same people. It's a name change that God gave to them as the beginning of fulfilling this covenant. And now God reconfirms this covenant. He had already given the covenant to Abraham, but Abraham didn't understand it. Now God comes back and he says, let me clarify. I'm reconfirming this covenant with you. I'm reconfirming this promise that a great nation is going to come from you. But it's not going to come from Hagar. That's not what I had intended. I intended for this nation to come from Sarah. And so now, you need to realize my covenant is going to happen, and it's going to come through your wife Sarah. Abraham laughs at this. He says, this can't be. I'm 99 years old and my wife is 90 years old. There's no way this can possibly happen. He doubted God's power. He doubted that God can do anything. But that didn't stop God. God continued moving forward. Abraham still didn't get it. He says, yes, God, thank you for this covenant. I understand. Thank you for giving me Ishmael, and it's going to come through Ishmael. God said, no. My covenant is not with Ishmael. My covenant is with Isaac, who's still coming. But I will still bless Ishmael. I'm not going to withdraw a blessing from him. He will be blessed also. And then God gives the name Isaac to Abraham. He says, you are going to have a son through your wife Sarah, and you're going to name him Isaac. And this is where the nation is going to come from. So now God confirms to Abraham that this covenant is going to come through Isaac, who's going to be born through Sarah. Now Abraham gets it. And he steps forward and he continues to move on in faith. And that's great. But today, and ever since that time, there's been this battle over birthright. Who is the one to receive God's covenant promise? Two parts of the world look at this promise in two different ways. There's a huge group of people that say that God's covenant is through Ishmael. There's a big group of people that say God's covenant is through Isaac. And today we have this conflict that is still happening. This is the conflict that causes the great division between Jews and Muslims. Because the Jewish people say the covenant comes through Isaac. The Muslims say no, the covenant comes through Ishmael. All the battles that are being fought in the world today in Islam go back to what happened with Abraham and God's covenant. And Abraham getting confused about what God was saying and trying to fulfill God's promise his own way. Now it's interesting, this fight over birthright, who is going to be the one that receives the future of the nation, is fought between these two men. And then Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau, and they battle over birthright too. They battle over who is the one that is the heir to the nation. And today, this conflict of birthright continues. We're victims of it today in Mali. The jihadists that are here battling, saying, we are the ones who are the heirs to God's promise. We are marching forward in the name of Islam as the descendants of Ishmael. And no one is going to get in our way because God promised this to us. Thousands of years later, this battle is being fought because of Abraham's poor decision. Thousands of years ago. One of the biggest centers of the conflict, the physical center of the conflict, goes back to Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount. On the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, we have this. But this was not always there. Originally, this was the site of the Jewish temple. The Jewish temple was destroyed and rebuilt again by King Herod. And then Romans came and destroyed the temple in 70 A.D. When that temple was destroyed, Jews no longer had a place to worship. The temple in Jerusalem was the central focus of all of their worship. They prayed towards the temple. They offered their sacrifices in the temple. And when this temple was destroyed, they didn't know what to do. The Jews said, "We have no place to worship today." Now there is one small remnant of that great temple that was built thousands of years ago. It's called the Western Wall. And the Western Wall sits up on the Temple Mount. And Jews still make a pilgrimage. Jews still come here every day to pray. It's taken on the nickname of the Wailing Wall because people come there to cry and to wail at the destruction of the temple. This is the last remaining place we have of the temple. There's nothing left but this wall. But we're going to continue to pray here. And we're going to continue to cry out for God. God, we want this place back. As Jews, we want this place back. We want to rebuild your temple. But they don't have access to it because Muslims came and took over the Temple Mount. And in 692 A.D., they completed the Dome of the Rock Church. It's that huge gold dome now that is the dominant architectural mark in Jerusalem. Where the temple once stood is now a mosque instead. Now, the Dome of the Rock is an elaborate, beautiful building. In fact, the top of it is actually covered in gold leaf. That is real gold. It's 80 kilograms of gold covering the top of the Dome of the Rock. Now, legend has it that the cornerstone of the Dome of the Rock is actually the central point of what was the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple. So the Dome of the Rock is built over the holiest site for Jews. And so this takes us back to this conflict that we have today. This conflict over who does Jerusalem belong to? Who does the Temple Mount belong to? Who is the heir of God's covenant? Who are the true descendants of Abraham? Is it Ishmael or is it Isaac? So, because of Abraham's choices, now we're dealing with big things. Now, Abraham did receive God's blessing. God did not withdraw his blessing on Abraham. Abraham received the blessing. And God said, even though you made a mistake, I am going to keep my promise, because when I make a promise, I can't take it back. So God kept his promise of bringing his nation through Abraham. Now our conflict comes because of Abraham's lack of trust. Because of his impatience. Because he didn't believe that God was going to accomplish this through his wife Sarah. He took matters into his own hands. And that's why we have the conflicts today. It's this battle over birthright. It's a battle over inheritance. It's a battle over who God's chosen people are. And it came because of this conflict that Abraham had with God. He got into this tug of war with God. Many of us are in tug of wars with God. What we have to realize is that when we're fighting God, when we're battling with this, that first of all, this is going to be an impossible battle. Have you ever seen a tug of war where two people or two groups of people pull on a rope to see who's stronger? Have you ever participated in that? In a tug of war with God, we're holding one end of the rope, God is holding the other end of the rope. Who do you think is going to win that tug of war? I mean, really, who do you think is going to win? We're up against impossible odds, and yet we still grab our end of the rope and we say, God, no, maybe if I pull a little bit harder, you're going to let go. Maybe if I pull a little bit harder, I'm going to be able to overpower your decision. This is silly, isn't it? Let me show you an example of what being outmatched in a tug of war looks like.
We have got Karen, Mary, and Liz, and they're going to be going up against Mr. Peaser Pants in Tiger Tug of War. Okay, let's gonna let him get a nice, good, and strong grip. And okay, effort and effort. Yeah. Like I was saying to the last group, if you want to if you kind of want to try, you can. He's not even doing anything. Peaser. Oh my gosh. And there we go. All right.
This is the tug of war we're in with God. Do you really think we're going to win? Do you think it's possible that we're going to be able to take on God and overpower God in His decisions? And yet we still try. What we don't realize is that when we're fighting against God's plans, His plans are so much better than ours. Our plans are so tiny, so minuscule, so inferior to what His plans are. Why do we do that? Why do we fight against Him and say, well, my feeble, stupid little plan is much better than yours, God? And yet we accept this. And we try to tell ourselves that my plans are going to be better than God's plans. Nothing could be further from the truth. And what we end up doing in this tug of war is we end up exhausting ourselves. We sit there and we pull and pull and pull and fight and fight and fight. And all it does is wear us out and depress us and take us to a point of exhaustion. Fighting God isn't going to get us anywhere. It's only going to wear us out. In Proverbs 19:21, it says, "You can make many plans, but the Lord's purpose will prevail." We can plan all we want, but God is ultimately going to have His way. So we shouldn't try to fight His ways. We shouldn't battle against Him. We should accept His plans and stop fighting this tug of war with Him. We have a lot of different reasons that we have this tug of war with God. One of the reasons that we fight with God is that we think that our ways are better than His ways. We think that our plans are better. God, I know you said this, but you're up there and I'm down here. I see things from my viewpoint that you possibly can't see up there so far away. And so I know that this is better. And so, why don't we just go with my way? Sometimes we don't go with God's plans because we're afraid. God's going to ask me to do something that I don't want to do. God's going to ask me maybe to go to a dangerous country like Mali. Maybe God's going to ask me to leave my family. Maybe God's going to ask me to give up something that I don't want to give up. Sometimes we don't follow God's plans because we don't trust Him. Like Abraham. Abraham didn't trust that God was going to be able to accomplish this through his wife Sarah, so he took matters into his own hands. We think maybe God's too busy, or maybe God doesn't quite understand everything, so we don't trust He's going to be able to fulfill things, so we take matters into our hands. Sometimes we count the cost and say, well, I'm not ready to make that kind of sacrifice. God, I'll follow your plans when it kind of fits into what I'm comfortable with. And we sit there and we fight with God. Sometimes we say to God, well, God, I understand what you're saying, but you don't understand. You wrote that. You wrote those laws. You wrote those those covenants, you wrote those thousands of years ago. Do you know how much culture has changed since then? That's the way you did things in Israel. That's the way the Hebrew people were. But in my culture is completely different. We don't do it that way here. And so we go back to God, and we say, God, no, we don't do it that way here. Let's do it our way. We don't want to offend people in our culture. Sometimes we say to God, well, God, things have changed a lot. That was then, this is now. Things are a lot different. Thousands of years ago, that's the way you did things, but now we're advanced. We have technology. Do you realize I have a phone in my pocket and I can communicate any place in the world at any time? Do you realize if there's any answer I need, I can Google it? God, I don't need you and I don't need your plan so much anymore because you've given us this great gift. And I'm going to use this instead. Sometimes it's our pride. Our pride gets in the way and we put limits on God. But God, you have developed me. I am the person I am today because this is the way you made me. And you made me to be smart. You made me to be wise. Therefore, what I'm thinking has to be the best idea. So we fight with God and we say, God, that's not the way things are. I know that you're saying this, but I believe that you gave me wisdom. And I believe that the wisdom you gave me is bigger than the wisdom that you have. Otherwise, you wouldn't have given it to me. God, things have changed. God, my culture is very different. God, I don't trust you. God, I'm afraid. God, I can't make that sacrifice. Just let's do it my way. Let's compromise. And so we do all this compromise. And we're like Abraham, fighting with God, saying, okay, God, I understand your plan. Let's do this together. Let's work in partnership. Let's come to the table and we'll put together the plan. Here's what I'm proposing. I understand what you're proposing. Let's just mix this all together and we'll all be happy. This is our tug of war with God. There's a Christian book called The Way Back. It says, somewhere along the way, we stopped aiming for radically impossible God-sized dreams and instead settled for realistically incremental man-sized progress. God wants to accomplish miracles through us in our world. But we stand in His way so many times and say, God, no. I don't believe you do those kinds of miracles anymore. We don't do things that way anymore. Let's do it my way. And what we miss out on is we miss out on seeing amazing, incredible things happen. This is a God that parted oceans. This is a God that can raise the dead. And yet we say, God, I don't want those kinds of miracles. That might scare people around us if something like that happened. So God, let's just kind of tone things down. Let's do it my way. I had a Malian friend come to me a few years ago. And he said, you are so fortunate to be an American. I said, oh really? Why do you think that? He says, because in America, you have the greatest medical system in the world. Didn't understand the cost of the medical system. He says, you have the greatest medical system in the world, therefore you have things so much better off than I do as a Malian. I said, that's interesting. I said, because I see things from a different perspective. I think that you are better off than I am. He says, why do you think that? He says, yeah, and I said, because we have such a wonderful medical system that we don't go to God when people get sick. We go to the doctor. We go to the hospital. We do everything we can using our medical technology to try to find healing. Then, when all of those options run out, then we run to God and say, okay, God, I've tried everything that I've had at my disposal. I've gone to all the doctors I know of. I've gone to the specialists. I've gone to the hospitals, and I'm not getting better, or my wife's not getting better, or my child's not getting better. Now I need you to intervene. We don't see miracles happen like other countries do. That when they have a sickness, when they have a disease, when they have a problem, they take it to God and they still see miracles happen. That there are so many places today where God performs miracles where the blind can now see again, the deaf can hear, the lame can walk. God even raises people from the dead to this day. But we don't give God the opportunity to do that because we say, we have our own way of doing this. And if we just stop and go to God first and say, God, I trust you. I trust you that miracles can happen. I trust that you can do things that people say are impossible to do. And if we stop fighting with God and say, God, I relent. Here I am. Use me. We will see amazing things happen. Now, we're not the only ones to fight with God and to have tug-of-wars with God. There's unfortunately a lot of tug-of-wars with God throughout the Bible. We have the story of Abraham's tug-of-war. Pharaoh, who was the ruler in Egypt during the time of Moses, had some big tug-of-wars with God. Moses came to Pharaoh, who had enslaved the Hebrew people. He said, Pharaoh, God says, let my people go. And Pharaoh said, God who? I am God in this country. Your God is not going to tell me what to do. I am bigger than your God. And so God started sending plagues. The plagues of Exodus. Flies. Hailstorms. Locusts. Frogs. And they went on and on. Each time, God is giving Pharaoh the opportunity, okay, let go of the rope, and this will stop. But Pharaoh said, no, I'm going to pull harder. I'm going to pull harder. And the last plague that God sends is wiping out the firstborn son in every family. Then Pharaoh finally lets go of the rope. But then he changes his mind after he lets the Israelites flee. He grabs the rope again and starts chasing them till they get to the Red Sea. The Israelites walk through the Red Sea. The Egyptian army is swallowed up because of Pharaoh's tug-of-war with God. Who won that one? Did Pharaoh win that one? King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had the opportunity to give his life to God, but then he didn't. He built a statue of himself, said, worship this statue. God said, no, people aren't supposed to worship you. You are supposed to worship me. And Nebuchadnezzar picked up the rope and said, no, God, I'm bigger than you. Look at this big statue I built. People are worshiping that. Who are you? And God said, okay, King Nebuchadnezzar, here's what's going to happen to you. You are going to turn into a wild beast, and you are going to live outside. You're going to eat grass like a cow for 7 years. This craziness overtook Nebuchadnezzar. He wound up losing his mind. He wound up wandering around outside like an animal for 7 years, eating grass. And then God gives him another chance. And Nebuchadnezzar turns around. But this battle still continues on with Nebuchadnezzar, this tug-of-war, time after time after time. There was a time when the Jews were passing through a country. And the king got upset. And he says, these Jews are going to overtake my country. And he hired this man named Balaam. He says, Balaam, I want you to go out and I want you to curse the nation of Israel. I want you to curse them so that they will not take over my country. Balaam said, okay, give me the money, I'll go out and I'll curse these people. He receives the money, he gets ready. Then God appears to Balaam in a dream. He says, Balaam, these are my people. Don't curse them. I want you to go out and bless them. Balaam picks up the tug-of-war rope. He says, well, I've got this money in my pocket. I've got this God talking to me in a dream. No. I'm going to choose my way. I'm going to go out and I'm going to curse these people. And he starts this tug-of-war with God. God says, no, you're not going to curse them. You're going to bless them. Balaam says, no, I'm going to go out and I'm going to curse them because that's what I'm paid to do. On the way, angel of the Lord stands in front of Balaam as he's riding on his donkey. And his donkey stops. Balaam's beating his donkey. Come on, stupid donkey, we got to go. But the donkey's not doing anything because the angel of the Lord is standing there with a flaming sword in front of the donkey. Balaam can't see it. Balaam's beating his donkey even more. Come on, you stupid donkey. Then the donkey turns around. He says, Balaam, why are you hitting me? I have been a faithful donkey for you for years. Why are you beating me? I'm not moving forward because you're not seeing the angel in front of you. And God opens up Balaam's eyes and he sees the angel. And Balaam realizes, wow, I've been having this tug-of-war with God. Balaam wasn't the last one to have a tug-of-war with God. Moses. Here's the man chosen by the Lord to lead the Israelites to the promised land. They're wandering in the desert for 40 years. They're getting so close. But then they're at a point where they run out of water. And the people are crying out to Moses. They're saying, you idiot! Why have you brought us to this place that doesn't have water? At least when we were slaves in Egypt, we were eating well. And we had water to drink, and we had a normal place to live. But now we're wandering around in the desert as nomads, living in tents. Come on! We don't even have water to drink. And Moses does the right thing. He prays. God, these people are dying of thirst. Please help us. And God tells Moses, okay, Moses, I've heard your prayer. Go out and speak to that rock and water will pour out. So Moses says, okay, Lord, I'll do that. And as Moses is walking out to the rock, he gathers all the people. He's got his faithful staff, the staff that parted the Red Sea, the staff that had turned into a snake, the staff that he had seen amazing miracles through. And he says, you know what? God told me to speak to this rock, but I'm going to do something bigger and better. God gave me this magic stick. I'm going to hit the rock with my magic stick to make water pour out. I don't need God, I've got my magic stick. And Moses stands up there and he hits the rock and water pours out. Tug of war with God. God told him, just go speak to this. Moses says, no, I'm going to showboat. I have my staff that you've given me that I perform miracles with. I'm going to perform the miracle with this. Because of that decision that Moses made, God told Moses, you will not enter the promised land. You've been waiting 40 years for this. It's right on the other side of this mountain. But you're not going to go in because of this tug of war that you had with me. Who won that one? Yet we continued to pull. Jonah. God tells Jonah, Jonah, you're an evangelist. I want you to go out to Nineveh. The people there are doing terrible things. I want you to preach my word because I want to save them. And Jonah said, no, God, because if I go and say that this disaster is going to come on them and a disaster isn't going to happen, then I'm going to look like an idiot. So Jonah gets on a ship and he says, I'm not going to Nineveh. I'm going somewhere else. Starts the tug of war. This tug of war goes out into the ocean. Jonah winds up being swallowed by a big fish. Who won that one? Our stories even continue into the New Testament. We have a man named Saul, a Pharisee, a very prominent leader in the Jewish nation. Jesus had come. Jesus fulfilled his covenant promise to mankind. He died on the cross for our sins, was buried, rose again on the third day, and then ascended back up into heaven. Paul never met Jesus, but these people that started following this, it was called the Way back then. They weren't called Christians, it was called the Way. And this man Saul, he said, these people have turned away from the Jewish faith and are following this man Jesus. That's wrong. I don't believe that is the right way. As a good Jew, this is the way we're supposed to do something. So he started collecting people and persecuting them. He stood by the side of the road holding people's jackets as Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was killed. And Saul was there celebrating this. Then one day, God met Saul on the road with a blinding light, and he changed Saul's life forever. Saul retells this story. He retells this story in Acts 26. In verse 13, he says, I was on the road, and a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shone down on me and my companions. We all fell down, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's useless for you to fight against my will. Saul lets go of the rope. He realizes there is no way I am going to be able to defeat this God. God does things different than I thought he did. And Saul lets go of the rope, and God transforms his life, and he becomes a new man. One of the greatest evangelists, one of the pillars of our Christian church, because he chose to let go of the rope. So we're in this tug of war. What do we need to do? How do we need to let go of the rope? What do we need to do to say, God, I don't want to fight with you anymore? First thing we need to realize is that whatever we're thinking, whatever's in our heart, God already knows it. We can't hide our ideas from God. We can't be plotting something and thinking of ideas in our head saying, well, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to make God believe something. Or I'm going to convince God of this through my actions. You know, God knows everything that we think. We can't hide anything from him. The psalmist says in Psalm 139, O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. So the ending of the tug of war needs to begin with us saying, you know what? I can't hide anything from God. I can't plot something that I think is better because he already knows what I'm thinking. So we need to let go of that. Sometimes we have this tug of war because we're afraid. We're afraid of what God wants to accomplish through us. We're worried about so many things. But we don't need to be worried. God has made promises to us. In Philippians 4, 6, and 7 says, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank him for all he has done. Then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. His peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ Jesus. So we can let go of the rope. If we're holding onto the rope because of our worries, we can let go because we don't need to be worried. God has our back. God says, let go of these things and I will give you peace. Don't worry about my plans. It's going to be okay. We need to let go and acknowledge that God is God and I am not. God is so much bigger than me. God made us. God knows our strengths. God knows our weaknesses. God knows our capabilities. God knows what He's doing. God can see around corners that we can't see around. God can see the future. God knows the past. God knows the present. God knows all of these things that we don't. And we need to come to that point of understanding that He's bigger, that He's more knowledgeable than we are, and let go of these things. And trust that He knows better than we do. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, God says, "My thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, and my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts." Our ways, our thoughts, our ideas are so tiny compared to God's. And yet we take on this tug of war. We say, "No, God, I know you say that, but I believe that I can overpower you." And we get involved in this impossible tug of war that we know we're not going to win. Let's look at another tug of war. This time it's not against a tiger. This time it's against an elephant.
Are you ready? Yes. 1, 2, 3, pull, pull, pull. Hey. Oh. 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 Pull, pull, pull. Close up it. Pull, pull. Oh. Okay, check the bill. Check the bill.
Serious. Do we think we're going to win a tug of war against an elephant? And yet an elephant is so tiny compared to God. Why are we even trying to take this on? We need to let go of the rope and say, "God, okay, I realize that I'm weak and you're strong." And we need to trust Him. We need to trust that He knows what He's doing. We need to trust that He is the creator of the universe, that His ways are far beyond our ways, that He knows so much more than we do, and that His ways are going to be okay. We sang a song this morning from Proverbs 3, 5 through 7. I've made this my life verse. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not depend on your own understanding. Seek His will in all you do, and He will show you which path to take. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. How many times do we not live this way? How many times do we not trust the Lord? How many times do we think that our ways are better? That God doesn't understand the way things are today? There's a woman named Babby Mason. She's a Christian singer and author. I love her words. She says, "God is too wise to be mistaken. God is too good to be unkind. So when you don't understand, when you don't see His plan, when you can't trace His hand, trust His heart." Even when we can't see God, that's when we need to trust Him the most. That's the point that Abraham was in. "God, I know you said this, but I don't trust you can do this, so I'm going to help you." God doesn't need our help. God says, even when you don't understand, even when you can't see, even when it seems impossible for you, trust me. I spoke the universe into existence. What makes you think that I can't see you through this problem? It's time for us to let go of the rope. It's time for us to give our problems to God, to stop trying to solve everything by ourselves. God says, "I don't want you to do this. Give your problems to me." In 1 Peter 5, 6 and 7, Paul says, so humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time He will lift you up in honor. Give all of your worries and care to God, for He cares about you. Give all your worries and cares to God, because He cares for you. We don't have to try to do things on our own. We need to bring them to God and lay them at His feet. Because then we can let go of the rope. We are so exhausted from fighting God and pulling on this rope day after day, night after night, week after week, year after year. And God says, let go. When you let go, then you can rest. Jesus gives us these beautiful words. He says, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. So instead of fighting against God, He says, let go. Let go and let me. You want to work together with me? Okay, let go of the rope and listen. Listen to what we're going to do together. Waylon Bailey is a pastor in the United States. He says, you will have many days when you don't know what God is doing. But you will never have a day when God doesn't know what He's doing. Put your trust in God even when you can't see His hand at work. Are you ready to let go? Are you ready to let go of that rope and trust that God has a plan to see you through? Lord, we thank you. We thank you for being a loving God who makes these covenant promises to us. A God who will see us through every trial and conflict we have. Whether it's a battle we're having at work, whether it's a problem with one of our neighbors, whether it's a roommate, whether it's a family member, Lord, whether it's a spouse, the closest person to us. Lord, may we trust that your plans are greater than our plans, and that your love is more than we could ever understand. Lord, today, we let go of the rope. We give our problems to you. We give our concerns to you. We give our sicknesses to you. We give our worries to you. We give our cares to you. We give our financial situations to you. Lord, thank you for loving us. And thank you for seeing us through. In Jesus' name, amen. So this week, some things to reflect about and think about. What's the worst plan or decision I've made? Maybe we can share this during our fellowship time today. What's the worst decision I've ever made, or what plan have I had that turned out to be a complete disaster? Then on the other side of that, what's the most amazing thing that I've seen God do, with or without me? Have I ever questioned God's plans? Have I ever said, well, God, I see what you're saying, but have I ever changed my plans because of God? Have I ever let go of the rope and said, okay, God, we will do things your way? And finally, what do I need to let go of? What do I need to let go of right now and trust God with? In the United States, there's a bumper sticker that some people have on their cars. It says, God is my co-pilot. I saw another bumper sticker a couple years ago that said, if God is your co-pilot, you're sitting in the wrong seat. We need to let God be the driver of our lives. We need to give Him the steering wheel and stop trying to direct things ourselves, because He knows where He's going. He knows where He wants us to go. And we need to let go and say, God, I give control to You. I'm letting go of the rope. I'm letting go of the steering wheel. We're going to close today with a song about doing that very thing. It's called Jesus, Take the Wheel.
She was driving last Friday on her way to Cincinnati on a snow-white Christmas Eve, going home to see her mama and her daddy with the baby in the back seat. 50 miles to go and she was running low on faith and gasoline. Been a long, hard year.
She had a lot on her mind and she didn't pay attention. She was going way too fast. And before she knew it, she was spinning on a thin black sheet of glass. She saw both their lives flash before her eyes. She didn't even have time to cry. She was so scared. She threw her hands up in the air. Jesus, take the wheel, take it from my hands, 'cause I can't do this on my own. I'm letting go, so give me one more chance. Save me from this road I'm on. Jesus, take the wheel.
It was still getting colder when she made it to the shoulder and the car came to a stop. She cried when she saw that baby in the backseat sleeping like a rock.
And for the first time in a long time, she bowed her head to pray. She said, I'm sorry for the way I've been living my life. I know I've got to change. So from now on tonight, Jesus, take the wheel, take it from my hands, 'cause I can't do this on my own. I'm letting go, so give me one more chance and save me from this road I'm on. Oh, Jesus, take the wheel. Oh, I'm letting go, so give me one more chance.
Save me from this road I'm on. From this road I'm on.
Jesus, take the wheel. Oh, take it from me.